Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Washington History Seminar, Historical Perspectives on International and National Affairs. This afternoon, we're featuring a recent book by Sheyda Jahanbani of the University of Kansas entitled The Poverty of the World, Rediscovering the Poor at Home and Abroad, 1941 to 1968. It was published last year by Oxford University Press. Our discussants this afternoon are Nick Colither of Indiana University and Alice O'Connor of the University of California, Santa Barbara. I'm Eric Arneson from the George Washington University. I co-chair the seminar with Christian Osterman of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, who's traveling and can't be with us today. As some of you may know, the seminar launched in 2010, and it's a collaborative and nonpartisan initiative of the Wilson Center's History and Public Policy Program and the American Historical Association. Before March of 2020, we gathered in person at the Wilson Center here in Washington, D.C. Since the summer of that year, we have been gathering, online, assembling participants from around the country and around the globe. A few quick things before we get started. First, as always, I'd like to recognize a key figure whose behind-the-scenes labors make these seminars possible, and that's Pete Bierstecker of the Wilson Center. Second, please take note of our next two sessions of the Washington History Seminar. We reconvene this coming Thursday, September 26th, just 3 days from now at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, to discuss I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction by Kidado Williams. And then next Monday, September 30th at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, we feature Weapons in Space, Technology, Politics, and the Rise and Fall of the Strategic Defense Initiative by GW historian Aaron Bateman. We invite you to join us for both. Third point, on the logistics front, today's session is being recorded and can soon be found on the seminar's YouTube page, where many dozens of past programs are archived. And finally, when we get to the question and answer section of the webinar, we ask those of you with questions to use the raise hand function or the Q&A function on Zoom. If you use the raise hand function, we call on you, you unmute, you can pose the question yourself. If you use Q&A, I get to pose your question for you. We'll call on as many folks as we can. And with that, we can get things officially started. Our author this afternoon is Sheyda Jahanbani, a scholar of U.S. foreign relations and global and international history in the 20th century in the Department of History at the University of Kansas. She got her undergraduate degree from Georgetown University's Edmund G. Walsh School of Foreign Service and her PhD from Brown University. An award-winning teacher, she's currently writing a history of global citizenship during the Cold War, as well as working on a digital history project to capture the experience of U.S. international development and nation-building endeavors in the decades after 1968. Today, she will be speaking on that new book, The Poverty of the World, Rediscovering the Poor at Home and Abroad, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. And it received the Stuart Bernath Prize for Best First Book from the Society of the Historians of American Foreign Relations, the Merle Curdy Prize in Intellectual History from the Organization of American Historians, and the Center for Presidential History's Distinguished Book Award. Sheyda, welcome to the seminar. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. And hello to everybody who's joining us today. Before I begin my official remarks, I just want to make a few informal comments. First, I want to express my gratitude to Christian and Eric for inviting me to present. Over the years, I've enjoyed many of these sessions virtually, and actually in the before times attended a few in person when research trips to DC allowed. So this is such a vital forum for helping us think about how historical research helps us make sense of our bewildering present. So I'm so grateful to be here. Second, I'm really so deeply gratified to have Nick Colither and Alice O'Connor here to comment on a book that really would not have come to be without them. As I think I've told both of them privately, the idea for this book came directly out of my experiences reading Alice's Poverty Knowledge alongside a provocative essay that Nick published in Diplomatic History about development. I vividly remember sitting down one day at a big table in the library with heavily annotated copies of both of those texts, a fresh legal pad, and writing out a series of research questions about the ways in which post-1945 poverty fighting at home and development abroad might have been intertwined. In the last few weeks of revising this manuscript, as I finally answered those questions to my own satisfaction, poverty knowledge and Nick's essay, as well as his brilliant history of food aid, The Hungry World, were among the handful of books that were still at my side. That Nick and Alice have been such models of scholarly generosity to me over the years really adds to my gratitude. Finally, I want to apologize in advance for my hoarse voice. I am actually in quarantine in my house right now, recovering from my very first bout of COVID. So I'm going to be hydrating a lot, and hopefully you'll be able to hear me without too much coughing and sniffling. Okay, so with all that said, let's get down to business. I want to begin today with an anecdote that I think helps us unlock the contributions that I'm trying to make with the book. As what little daylight that still shone on the city of Stockholm faded on a late October afternoon in 1969, the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal sat down at his cluttered desk to write the preface to his latest book manuscript, The Challenge of World Poverty. The sizable tome, which was Myrdal's 11th in English, came out of a series of lectures that he had delivered earlier that year at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Nearly 3 decades after he had become part of the global intellectual elite, Myrdal was still among the most influential figures in the world of ideas. Then almost 70, he had finally published his long-awaited Asian drama, An Inquiry into the Poverty of Nations, which was a 3-volume study of poverty in South Asia, intentionally titled as a coda to his American Dilemma, the 2-volume study of race relations in the United States, that had made him a household name in America in the 1940s. In the years between commencing the research for Asian drama and celebrating its publication, Myrdal, like many liberals, had felt the ground underneath his feet shift. The United States government, mired in its disastrous war in Vietnam, was backpedaling on its commitment to fight poverty at home and abroad. And he feared the consequences of an American retreat, not just for the United States, for which he had enormous personal affection, but for humanity writ large. Therefore, when presented with an opportunity to outline a policy program for the future, he jumped at it. The challenge of world poverty could, he hoped, serve as a call to arms for liberals to reinvigorate their global war on poverty. In hindsight, Myrdal wound up writing a book that was more post-mortem than manifesto. In its opening pages, he reflected on the decade that had just passed, one in which unprecedented attention had been paid by politicians, intellectuals, and average middle-class Americans to the problems of the poor around the world. There is a great parallel, he wrote, between the international problems of the poverty in underdeveloped countries and the poverty problems in the United States, and also between the ways in which these two complexes of problems have surfaced to popular consciousness. The policy programs that had been intended to solve those problems, he wrote, shared similar faults. They were thought of in too diminutive terms, he said, not really corresponding to the scope of needed reforms and the stirring declarations. And they were both failing. That sober fact notwithstanding, they were born, Myrdal argued, of the same noble impulse by American liberals to make a better world. The problems of poverty at home and abroad, he concluded, were, quote, both raised to public awareness and political importance by an intellectual and moral catharsis. In the international field, he explained, this catharsis occurred soon after the Second World War and the great political changes following in its wake. In the United States, the awakening to awareness of the enclaves of people living in misery did not occur until the end of the 1950s. So when I first read this passage, I stopped in my tracks. I was at the time embarked on a research project that sought to uncover the conceptual and programmatic connections between the war on world poverty that the US government began after 1945 and the war on poverty at home that President Lyndon Baines Johnson officially declared in 1964. As often happens, if you're lucky when you revisit familiar sources with new eyes, I had found a kind of staggering number of linkages between those programs, from obvious ones like Sergeant Shriver's simultaneous leadership of the Peace Corps and the war on poverty, to more obscure ones. like the fact that one of the most influential theorists of poverty in the US in the early 1960s, an anthropologist named Oscar Lewis, had actually never researched domestic poverty at all, but instead had been a roving development expert working in Latin America and India. These findings, and many others that I offer in the book, revealed the artificiality of the divisions that scholars all too often put up between domestic and foreign policy. So I had sussed out with this work the project's historiographical intervention. It would demonstrate that the war on poverty at home and abroad were, in fact, deeply intertwined. Good. But I didn't quite have my hands around the historical significance of the story I was telling until I read those words by Myrdal. His contention that Americans experienced a catharsis in the years after World War II, which led them to mount an attack on poverty at home and abroad, compelled further consideration. A catharsis, after all, is not a policy or a political campaign. A catharsis is an emotional release, an expurgation of feeling, a purification ritual. So why had poverty fighting become a catharsis for mid-century Americans? Answering this question required me to shift the focus of the project away from poverty, a keyword to which I had clung, and toward affluence. It demanded that I think more about why America's extraordinary wealth in the years after World War II had paradoxically created such a renewed concern for the poor. And it helped me see the larger war on poverty that I had documented as part of a larger mission. The poverty of the world is the result of my efforts to figure those questions out. And in the book, I make three central claims. So I'm going to sketch them out very briefly here and give you a sense of the narrative that supports them, and then I'll make a few closing remarks before opening up to comments and questions. So first, in response to Myrdal's observation, I argue that because of the jarring contrast between the world's poverty and America's wealth in the years after 1945, a group of influential liberals rediscovered poverty as an explicitly global social problem, one that they believed the United States was uniquely responsible for and capable of solving. Second, I assert that the development discourse, especially the concept of underdevelopment that had emerged in social science in the 1940s, provided the intellectual building blocks of this conception of global poverty and shaped the solutions that the poverty-fighting liberals that I write about designed to fight it. Third, I contend that in the years between 1945 and 1968, these liberal poverty fighters intentionally advance an alternative vision of American empire based on their theory of global poverty, what I call an empire of affluence, to contest the strategic one that the US government pursued in the context of the global Cold War. The protagonists of the book are a small cast of liberal intellectuals and policymakers whose names might be familiar to many of you. Oscar Lewis, John Kenneth Galbraith, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., Michael Harrington, and Sargent Shriver are among them. What ties each of these characters together is that they identified on the left liberal spectrum of American political life. They experienced the formative years of their political educations during the Great Depression and the New Deal. They opposed militarism as a method of maintaining and extending American hegemony, and they used their expertise and cultural capital to exert as much authority as they could over the commanding heights of policymaking. These were the most prominent members of a larger community who came to believe that poverty was the most urgent threat facing a democratic world order, and that the United States was uniquely capable of launching a global war against it because of its conspicuous wealth. They researched and wrote about poverty explicitly to awaken middle-class Americans to the problem, and they lobbied for and implemented strategies to win that war at the highest levels of US government. And for a time, they succeeded. To support the three central claims that I make in the book, the mutually constitutive relationship between global poverty and American affluence, the rise of underdevelopment as an explanatory framework, and the creation of an alternative vision of US empire, the poverty of the world begins before the onset of the Cold War with the reformer John Collier. When this ubiquitous figure in American progressivism, and kind of an oddball, to be honest, became Franklin Roosevelt's Bureau of Indian Affairs commissioner, he sought to overthrow the century-long project of forced assimilation that he believed impoverished and alienated Native peoples from American democracy. Identifying poverty among indigenous communities as a consequence of colonization, Collier used his position to create both demand and supply for new ideas about poverty, explicitly anticipating a time when the United States would be in a position to dictate a policy of what Collier called democratic development for the, quote, frustrated millions of colonized peoples around the world. I then explore the creation of an explicitly cross-cultural theory of poverty, one that updated distinctions between rich and poor for an age of cultural relativism and global development. In 1943, Oscar Lewis was a young anthropologist looking for an opportunity to study the relationship between modernization, as the term that was in vogue at the time, and political economy. John Collier hired Lewis to manage applied development programs to improve the nutrition and health of indigenous Mexicans. Erasing the boundaries between research and action, Lewis spent the next 2 decades arguing that poverty was a universal phenomenon with characteristics that transcended the spatial, economic, and historical circumstances in which poor communities lived. He spent his career, during which he became a best-selling author and policy advisor, pursuing the claim that poverty everywhere was a problem of underdevelopment. Shifting from the realm of ideas to the arena of politics, the book then traces the domestic and international political conditions that galvanized novel thinking about American affluence in the years of the early Cold War. Following the career of economist John Kenneth Galbraith, I chart the emergence of the empire of affluence as a political idea by exploring the ways in which Galbraith and others articulated the US's new global responsibility to solve world poverty. Galbraith and others argued that defending US national security in a complex world demanded that Americans accept responsibility for promoting human welfare beyond, as well as within, the borders of the United States. By the 1950s, liberals were in political exile for the first time in nearly 2 decades. Faced with fierce political opposition on their right in the United States and on their left across the globe, they struggled to answer one overarching question: what should an anti-imperialist, anti-communist liberalism look like? In response, Galbraith and others worked to sharpen an argument about what the, quote, affluent society, as his best-selling 1958 book called it, owed to its most vulnerable citizens, and indeed to the world. Galbraith, along with historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, and a host of young activist liberals, including Hubert Humphrey and Chester Bowles, spent their decade in the political wilderness, working to convince the Democratic Party to embrace America's singular responsibility to build an empire of affluence. The book then explores how liberal concerns about underdevelopment in the decolonizing world came back home in the early 1960s. Revisiting Michael Harrington's now classic The Other America, I argue that the ideas that had shaped liberal foreign policy actually helped liberal intellectuals reimagine persistent poverty in a land of abundance. Explaining the context in which Harrington popularized Oscar Lewis's theory of a culture of poverty, I chart how the encounter with poverty abroad reframed persistent want at home as a condition of underdevelopment. Owing to the political and intellectual groundwork that poverty-fighting liberals had done throughout the 1950s, as well as the rise of the Third World as the primary theater of the Cold War, the Kennedy and Johnson administrations finally embraced the importance of waging a global war on poverty in the 1960s. The roots of the domestic war on poverty, embraced by Lyndon Johnson after Kennedy's assassination, are to be found in Kennedy's most popular foreign aid program, the Peace Corps. That program was devised by one of Kennedy's most liberal advisors and his brother-in-law, Sergeant Shriver. Shriver was deeply embedded in the world of post-war liberalism and carried the assumptions and concerns of thinkers like Galbraith and Schlesinger with him to the Peace Corps and the war on poverty. I trace the evolution of three distinct iterations of the Peace Corps idea, as Shriver called it, all of which depended upon the same basic prescription for fighting poverty, revealing the ways in which the US government built a volunteer army to spread affluence to every corner of the American empire. Toward the end of the book, to understand how the ideology of the empire of affluence impacted the troops on the ground, I delve more deeply into how everyday Americans interpreted the problem of global poverty and made sense of their roles in solving it. I argue that by the mid-1960s, the volunteer, always capitalized in government documents, had become an icon in American popular culture, depicted in still and moving images, children's literature, and first-person memoirs of life on the front lines. These images and narratives illustrated not just what it meant to fight poverty around the world, but what it meant to be an affluent American. The most significant impact of the liberal campaign to build an empire of affluence was not, I conclude, the eradication of global poverty, but actually the creation of a new kind of liberal citizen, one who saw social problem solving as the purview of the cosmopolitan individual, and who volunteered to serve America's vision of humanitarianism at home and abroad. Of course, even Gunnar Myrdal had to realize that by 1969, his dreams of a new assault in the global war on poverty were unlikely to come true. The war in Vietnam had eclipsed the global war on poverty, and the poverty-fighting liberals about whom I write had ultimately failed. Their failure had nothing to do with the inability of the poor to take advantage of the beneficence of an affluent society, as conservatives would later charge, and everything to do, I argue, with the failure of will, courage, and empathy among those in charge of that society. The people who made the ultimate decisions about how to spend American treasure at home and abroad decided to spend it on guns rather than butter, and they chose guns over butter because at the end of the day, they simply had more faith in guns. A moral catharsis, Myrdal called it. To be sure, the liberals whose stories I tell were inspired by their own sense of the moral challenges facing a rich country. They were also embroiled in a global conflict with an ideology that argued for justice, even if it meant sacrificing freedom. Although they argued ferociously for an empire of affluence, the United States government ultimately chose to invest more in an empire of force. And so despite the efforts of the poverty-fighting liberals I write about, their moral struggle amounts to little more than a failed experiment. We are, as I write in the book, still living with the consequences. Thank you.
Sheyda, thank you very much. Our first discussant this afternoon is Nick Colither, is professor of history and international studies at Indiana University, as well as the editor of the journal Diplomatic History. A specialist in the history of U.S. foreign relations, the history of intelligence, development, and nation building, he is the author of The Hungry World, America's Cold War Battle Against Poverty in Asia, published in 2010 with Harvard University Press, Illusions of Influence, The Political Economy of United States-Philippines Relations, 1942 to 1960, published by Stanford University Press in 1994, and Secret History, the CIA's classified account of its operations in Guatemala, 1952 to 1954, whose second edition, Stanford University Press, published in 2006. Nick, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the seminar.
I'm really glad to be here. And Sheyda, thank you for giving us a magnificent book. It's a book that changes our mind about a lot of things. And I want to, in my comments, just talk a little bit about perhaps the opposing point of view, or at least the view that your book helps us unseat or replace, as it were. And it's really the version of the 1960s that I tell in my introductory history lectures. And it's a version of history that is evident in a lot of histories of the 1960s, including PBS has just reissued the Lyndon Johnson series, which they're airing again, I think because of its perhaps similarity to the trajectory of one of the candidates in the current election. It's a story that begins with Michael Harrington. and the so-called discovery of poverty. It's something that you allude to in your subtitle. So it starts there, and then it kind of goes to the war on poverty with Lyndon Johnson. And it's posed as a kind of a tragedy in the sense that Lyndon Johnson really wanted to pursue the Great Society and pursue the war on poverty. And this notion of the discovery of poverty was a key element of that. That the argument was that in the early 1960s that the New Deal had effectively worked, that it had brought prosperity to the United States. The war had helped to gin up the economy. We had had a tremendous 1950s filled with prosperity. All of that had worked, except for a few what they called islands of poverty. And these were both demographic and geographical. You had Appalachia as a region of the United States that had somehow been left behind. You had inner city America. I think this was actually the time when they began to talk about the inner cities as an issue. This was, enclaves within the center of American cities, racial enclaves, were left behind as well. But there were also demographic groups that were left behind, particularly the elderly, who are handicapped, particularly by high healthcare expenses. So the story culminates with the Great Society and the war on poverty, and then the way in which the Vietnam War kind of drains that of energy. But the characters in that story are Harrington, Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, some opponents or at least nemeses of various kinds, Richard Russell, and other key figures. You give us a quite different story in a number of respects, both in the way you tell the story and in the themes you choose. If I could kind of go through some of the ways in which your themes contrast with that, your first theme, that international development and foreign policy and domestic poverty policy was intertwined in a deep way, that they were in fact identical, and there was a kind of a universalistic sense of poverty. Really kind of cuts against this notion that these were two opposing forces, that it was guns versus butter. In the eyes of the people you're talking about, those two things were, they were not just linked concepts. They were the same concept. And they were kind of moving in tandem with one another. Your second theme is that linkage avoided a sense of causes and really looked to solutions. Poverty, in the sense that they kind of looked at causes, was caused by a kind of fatalism and an attitude that improvement was unattainable. Here you kind of trace this intellectual history of these ideas back much earlier than Harrington. And in fact, when we talk about this culture of poverty idea in the story that's typically told, the person it's linked with is Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And it's interesting that Daniel Patrick Moynihan appears in your book, but he's a really minor character. He's really kind of a latecomer to this ideas, and he's really collecting ideas that have been batted around for decades by the time he gets to them. Thirdly, the discovery of poverty really began with the problem of affluence. And this is a very interesting finding in your book. And affluence was seen as a foreign policy problem. Those of us who study development have often talked about the way in which the notion of development itself normalizes affluence, positing the idea that a modern society, a normal society, the society all countries ought to aspire to become, is a high consumption society. And at this time, and what you're talking about here is an era in which Americans, and even high-ranking Americans, policy-making Americans, saw affluence as abnormal and perhaps harmful to the United States' ability to relate to the countries that it very much needed to connect with in order to win the Cold Problematic also because of the way in which it tended to make Americans complacent about a lot of issues. So I wonder, perhaps we can talk a little bit about that. And finally, one of your themes is that the instrument for solving these problems, the way in which action would take place on these issues, would come through the young middle-class volunteer who could model an optimistic outlook of the world and serve as a change agent, but could also, through their work on poverty, assume a critical view of the affluent community from which they came. And so part of the work of poverty fighting was to have an effect on the poverty fighter and to send them back into their communities with a new and a changed attitude. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about some of the choices you made as a writer, some of which are choices that really cause your narrative to tell a very different story from the one that we've been talking about. But some of which, all of which I think really help to make a really large and a potentially ungainly story very comprehensible and easy to follow. You pose this as a series of biographies, and biographies of peripheral figures. I think, as I've said, the way in which we tell this story, it tends to go from Michael Harrington straight to Lyndon Johnson, through Daniel Patrick Moynihan and other kind of well-known figures. Your figures, starting with John Collier, tend to be people we haven't necessarily heard of, or if we have heard of them, such as John Kenneth Galbraith or Arthur Schlesinger, we've heard of them in a very different context than they've been posed before. So I wonder if you might talk just a little bit about, I'll mention a couple of other choices that I see as a writer as well, but I wonder if you might talk a little bit first about that your decision to write the book that way, to write it as a series of biographies.
Those are all wonderful comments. So exciting to hear you think about the book. I, as a historian, I like learning about people and how they live through their moment. I think one of the things history gives us is a sense that we can all make it through bewildering times, and that we're all trying to figure it out. And so watching people think, watching them think through problems is sort of the most fascinating aspect of historical scholarship to me. So to a certain extent, when I designed the kind of research agenda for the program, for the project, I knew that I would be looking at a kind of a set of key people, and that I wanted to see them thinking. I didn't quite know what they were going to be thinking, but I figured that out as I went along. And then actually something kind of else shaped my commitment to the choice of really focusing on these key individuals and trying to write in a more biographical tone, which is, as I saw them thinking, I became really attuned to the way in which these figures were not just reacting to the problems of their moment, but also world making, to use a phrase that I find very useful intellectually. They were trying to imagine what a different world could look like. And, I'm a child who grew up, I was a child in the 1980s. I'm a child of the 70s. And there was such a paucity of imagination among political figures and policymakers growing up that I felt acutely. And so I think I became very sympathetic is not the right word, but I became really attuned to the extent to which this group of people were trying to imagine a big idea, a world without poverty. And they were trying to make politically compelling arguments for why the United States should invest its time and resources in trying to bring that world about. And so, I think that became the story that I wanted to tell, as I really thought, as I said in my remarks, about this discovery of poverty in this historical moment as a kind of catharsis. I became intrigued by the way in which these folks were trying to imagine a different world. And in terms of choosing the characters that I did, to a certain extent, the project began as what I thought was going to be kind of a revisionist account of the war on poverty. I thought that what I was doing was trying to look for these global connections. And so that I would kind of start with a cast of characters who made sense, Oscar Lewis, Shriver. Shriver really was the first one who I was like, how do we not know more about Sergeant Shriver, who both headed a very successful foreign aid program and then was asked to direct the war on poverty at home. And through the kind of initial cast of characters, other individuals' experiences were opened up. I didn't expect to know anything or learn anything about John Collier, but what an intriguing person who's really trying to, because he was so focused on the poverty of Native communities in the United States. He'd been an activist for the American Indian movement in the 19-teens and 20s. He'd come right out of the kind of settlement house movement during the Progressive era. He became really fixated on the ways in which, essentially colonization had produced the conditions of poverty. And he wanted to make an argument for the importance of researching that and using social science to do so. And also he from as early as the mid-1930s is saying this is going to be an important problem that the world faces, as he didn't use the term decolonization, but he was referring to the sort of global shift away from formal empire, and saying that we needed to build up a storehouse, we, the social problem-solving liberals, needed to build up a storehouse of knowledge that could help address the poverty and the poor health and poor living conditions of people who had been colonized. So, to a certain extent, the project opened up new vistas as I kept getting to know my characters better and realizing who they were in conversation with and who they were connecting with. I do think in a way it became, I don't want to use a kind of fancy term like network analysis, but what I do think I present in the book actually is a network of people who all, focused on the same basic prescription for how the United States should be in the world. And through a variety of institutional and personal connections, prosecuted an argument over the course of 30 or 40 years.
The new vistas part is the part that really intrigues me, that really you tell a story that's going on in parallel with some developments that are central to the kind of orthodox histories of this period. For instance, one of the choices that you make is to talk about these people who are figures who are a little bit toward the margins of the policymaking circle, but who nonetheless are having a tremendous effect. One of the things, and there's a number of things you choose not to do in here, or to put slightly off stage. We hear the rumblings of those things coming from off stage, but they're not as central as they might be in another place. So, for instance, you don't go into all of the legislation around the war on poverty, the creation of Head Start, Medicare, Medicaid. That's Robert Caro's book, which supposedly he is still writing 900 words a day on at that Long Island retreat of his. And one day it may eventually come out. But you're basically saying that's his story. While that's going on, you're telling a very different story about a set of ideas that are making their way into policy alongside that. For the most part, you don't talk about the civil rights movement. Again, Martin Luther King is there, but a lot of historians have kind of tended to emphasize that relationship between Martin Luther King and Lyndon Johnson as kind of core to shaping his ideas and that sort of thing. You're less interested in that than you are in again, a set of ideas that may have already been in place before that relationship was even formed and already have been in motion. And until the end of your book, the Vietnam War doesn't really figure into this. Again, it's there, but it's very much off stage. Were those intentional decisions to kind of take those huge stories, which obviously could not fit in any book, but also to find a way in which to tell a very different story than has conventionally been told?
Yeah, I mean, they were both practical reasons. As my editor can attest, the final draft of the manuscript came in about 40,000 words longer than the book you have before you. So there were things that had to be excised. But in the process of sort of carving the final sculpture, I think what I really wanted to do is, primarily I identify as a historian of the US and the world, and I wanted the foreign relations story, the place of the United States in the world, the sort of broader thinking about the dramatic change of the US's role in the world after 1945. I wanted that to remain the central branch or trunk of the narrative. And I felt like there were many different places I could go. And as I say, in the first final draft, there were many places I did go. But when I had to make tough choices about what to include and what to cut, it was that main story that I wanted to propel the narrative. I wanted this sort of relationship that all of these people that I write about had to thinking through how the US should be in the world. I wanted that to be front and center. And so, ultimately the legislative battles over the war on poverty are beautifully documented in so much excellent scholarship, which I would hope people would read alongside this, but they were not directly germane to the question of how the United States was and how these figures, were making an argument about how poverty fit into essentially U.S. empire. So this is sort of where I began to discipline myself around making those choices. If you ever want to see the director's cut of the book, I'm happy to share it with you.
Eric, I have many other things I want to ask about, but I want to throw it back to you and to Alice.
Great. And keep those questions in mind. There will be time later, perhaps, for you to get them in. Before I introduce our second discussant, let me remind you that you can get in the queue now if you have a question or comment. Remember, raise hand means that we unmute you, you unmute yourself, and you ask the question. The Q&A, I read your question, but it's not too early to get in line now. Several people already have. Alice O'Connor is professor of history and director of the Blum Center on Poverty, Inequality, and Democracy at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is the author of Social Science for What? Philanthropy and the Social Question in a World Turned Right Side Up, published by the Russell Sage Foundation in 2007, and Poverty Knowledge, Social Science, Social Policy, and the Poor in 20th Century U.S. History, published by Princeton in 2001. She's also the co-editor of Poverty in the United States, an encyclopedia of history, policy, and politics, Urban Inequality, Evidence from Four Cities, and Beyond the New Deal Order, U.S. Politics from the Great Depression to the Great Recession. Alice, I'm very glad you didn't get called for jury duty today, and that you could join us this afternoon. Welcome.
Great, thank you. And thank you for having me at this forum. And Sheyda, thank you for writing this wonderful book. I want to say congratulations, above all. It's a beautifully written, beautifully realized, and persuasively argued book, and that deserves all the kudos and awards and attention that it's going to continue to get. I want to echo a couple of the things Nick said in saying I think the book does a really terrific job of making the case that the notion of leading a struggle against global poverty was central to the whole post-war liberal project, and situating that not just in thinkers, but in actual, if you don't discuss them in details, but at least reference to key policy imperatives of the time. I also, again, I will echo Nick in saying that this does challenge a narrative that poverty was somehow, quote unquote, invisible in domestic discourse and domestic politics in the post-war period, is sort of somehow out of sight until the 1960s, when it was supposedly rediscovered. Although I will note there that this notion of the invisibility of poverty is itself central to the entire framing of the issue, by no one more than Michael Harrington, and no one more actually also than Dwight MacDonald, whom you rightly credit with his lengthy review in the New Yorker drawing attention to Michael Harrington's book. This notion of our invisible poor is something that, Harrington, and to a large degree, John Kenneth Galbraith as well, they make a very big issue of the notion that the distinctive character of poverty in the post-war period, in the US at least, is that it is no longer a so-called mass phenomenon, and therefore has become invisible in the context of an achievement that had hitherto been unimagined, that is the achievement of mass prosperity. So while upending that narrative that somehow poverty was not on the policy agenda, which you do quite well, and importantly, this notion of poverty being an invisible issue, I think, continues to be a really important current in the discourse. I really appreciate the degree to which you also talk about, you sort of trace the lineages of the concepts of underdevelopment in a way that other people haven't. You re-periodize that, if you will. The notion of the development discourse is one that's very much a Cold War, post-World War II phenomenon. You challenge, especially through Collier, by tracing out its lineages in earlier thought, which is a really, I think, an extremely important contribution. And then I do really appreciate the way you reposition the whole narrative by arguing that all of this originated in these anxieties about affluence. But I mean, what I appreciate that the anxieties of affluence notion is that in your rendition of the anxieties of affluence, the anxiety is definitely about this notion that the US has lost its way. It's become entrapped in this idea of affluence as being all about mindless consumerism, the consumption of needless wants, and the suburbanization, the suburban ideal where it's increasingly possible to ignore the labor of others that makes this affluence possible. But you go beyond that in a way, and I appreciate the way you made that point in your opening remarks, by arguing that this is about power as well. It is about affluence presenting a challenge to the notion of how the US how the liberal US, at least in the vision of liberals, should responsibly exercise the immense power that its dominance in the world economy was bringing to bear. So I think that is a really important intervention. And then finally, I would say you do a really, as well, effective job of showing very concretely about how some of these, specifically these anxieties about affluence and the exercise of power in the world, translated it in at least one instance of a war on poverty program into these initiatives that were as much concerned about the image of, if not the actual experience of this, what you call the imagined community of the altruistic, affluent volunteers in the Peace Corps program and VISTA in particular. Though there I will again mention, and I'll come back to this at the end, those programs were but one piece, as you have acknowledged, of a much broader set of initiatives that actually also involved a domestic political economy agenda, as well as the project of expanding the more social democratic, but also racially democratic vision of what the social contract could be. So I do want to, I have some questions that, and we can sort of take them one by one. I think this idea about the empire of affluence, this notion that there is a distinctive vision of a non-militaristic but still imperial project that informs liberalism. I find that idea intriguing. I understand the conceptual underpinnings from the book, but I feel like I want to hear a little bit more about how that vision of an empire of affluence, a sort of benign imperial influence, how it actually played out in policy, how you see it actually playing out in policy with regard to specific policies, USAID, some of the things that you mentioned, but also I think in terms of the sort of institutional outlets, like when you talked before about this empire of affluence being grounded in an idea of the US needs to take control of the commanding heights of policy. So what does that, what does that amount to? What are the commanding heights that were the outlets in your view of this empire of affluence?
Those are thank you for the comments, and yeah, that's a really important question. I mean, I think that there were a couple times in, especially reading through, let me just give you a little sense of where this sort of origin of my notion of this as an imperial formation, that thinking came from, and then I'll talk about how I think it played out in policy. So there was Galbraith I knew would be kind of a central figure because The Affluent Society is one of those books that in the conventional narrative of the war on poverty is identified as, a key catalyst for public awareness, and it was a bestseller. The thought that a many 100-page book about economic history would be a bestseller is so staggering to me, but there it is. And you're absolutely right to note that Galbraith in the book really identifies poverty as what he calls an afterthought, right? He thinks that the key argument of the Affluent Society, which is, still a pretty engaging piece of scholarship, is that industrial capitalism has solved the scarcity problem, and that the United States, as the foremost industrial power, has, for the first time, really shown what a world could be like in which poverty was just a solvable problem. You could just redirect some resources here and there, especially in these pockets of poverty. He was sort of the first one to use that kind of imagery, that analogy, and that you could eradicate poverty in the United States. But Galbraith, when I really dove into his thinking and the origins of his interest in these questions, I read extensively about his experience in Europe in World War II, right after the war. And he's kind of the first one who got me thinking about this as an imperial formation, because there's a wonderful scene, which I recount in the book. He's sent right at the end of the war to participate in this massive study of the efficacy of strategic bombing. He's sent by the State Department and the War Department. He goes to Germany. He's interviewing all of these German officials who are now defeated, and he's asking all these questions about the economic organization of the war effort. He also goes to Japan to do the same thing. And in the meantime, he's writing to his wife, and he says to her, until I got here and saw how destroyed this place was and how much power is on the ground with the US Army, I had no idea what the United States was. And my sense when I read that is he's basically acknowledging that the United States is an imperial power that has this extraordinary capacity to move men and material across the world to basically rebuild, this destroyed world. And that started making me attendant to where my characters were, my historical subjects were kind of making that leap where they were talking about US power in relation to the poverty that they saw in Europe first and then in the Third World. And it was kind of striking to see how many times that came up. And so I started thinking about whether it was useful to frame this as an imperial formation. And I suppose I chose to do that precisely for the reason you noted, which is that it really recentered American power in this story. And it kind of, one of the things I've always found a little bit annoying is that this distinction between soft power and hard power that political scientists make and we as historians of US foreign relations often adopt. And I liked that this actually helped me bridge those two concepts by saying, let's think about different visions of American empire and the tools that the protagonists in each, or the advocates for each vision saw at their disposal. And so thinking more about this, both from the primary sources that I was reading and also about the utility of this concept as a way to recenter American power in the story, convinced me that it was, worth stepping into what is a kind of sticky territory and really think about empire as the key subject that I was writing about. So that's a little bit about where it came from. In terms of how I think the empire of affluence as a project of this community of poverty-fighting liberals that I write about, how it affected policy, I kept expecting to see people arguing throughout the 1940s, and when I talk about the commanding heights of policymaking, I mean, the influence that these individuals sought to have on presidential administrations, especially the Truman administration, through the State Department, but also through the Defense Department and the newly created National Security Council. And then also they create an organization called Americans for Democratic Action that's supposed to very explicitly be a kind of lobbying force to ensure that liberal ideas and priorities will be in political conversations that the Democratic Party has. So those are sort of what I think of as the commanding heights. But one of the things I kept seeing is the extent to which the UN was not seen as a solution to these questions about who would do the work of poverty fighting. You would think that this internationalist bunch of people who believe very much in the kind of cooperative enterprises that UNESCO, for instance, was undertaking, would see the UN as the primary vehicle through which this work should be done. And yet, pretty much by the first year of the Cold War, the very clear through line that I saw in the sources was, the United States should do this, because this is about, first of all, achieving the objective of preventing human disasters like what was taking place in Europe in 1947 with programs like the Marshall Plan. But also this is about showing the world that there are two superpowers, but one of them has the best interests of poor people at heart. And so it's really through policies like, the ADA's approach to the UN, to the Marshall Plan, to what becomes the first program aimed at development in the Global South, the Point 4 program, that I sort of saw that discourse or that debate taking shape, and the people that I was writing about consistently arguing that, yeah, we want the UN to do it, but we also need to be the ones doing it. The UN's, obligations do not mean that we shouldn't have these programs that are American and that get the credit, if we want to be kind of coarse about it, for achieving these aims.
So a couple of thoughts just bouncing off of that. One, I think this brings home to me like the distinction between a war on global poverty led by the US versus a global war on poverty that kind of, assumes some sense of international cooperation, which is the language that is being used today, among the first world nations. So it's an interesting juxtaposition. I think the other thing I would just bring up here is that I think I appreciate your clarification on how they saw all those UN agencies, which after all were sort of the institutional nexus of this post-war development state, as many historians have shown us. But also they sort of sidestepped those. And the question, of course, is why? But also, of course, the use of NGOs, especially foundations. And that, of course, comes up in your discussion of Oscar Lewis as this policy entrepreneur who kept getting, grants from the Ford Foundation to position himself as a global expert. Of course, this is a theme Nick has written about in his own work as well. So I want to just in some ways link this to a related question, and it actually brings up an issue that Nick raised before, which is that this collection of people that you write about who are, let's put it out there, they're all white men. So I wonder if you had anxieties about that when you were choosing your subjects to write about. So maybe you could share that with us, because that's something that, people writing these narratives are constantly keeping in mind. But what I did notice, they all seem like this entire discourse seems curiously disconnected from the central domestic, but also the global issue, the struggle for racial justice. And, whether it's the civil rights movement or the anti-colonial struggle, and the anti-colonial struggle that was taking in these very institutions that wanted to position themselves as the commanding heights internationally, including the UN. So these people who are imagining this benign empire of affluence, to what degree do you see them coming up against opposition, coming up against critique, especially, from the anti-colonial movement, but also from, the civil rights leaders in the US questioning the assumptions that were underlying their project?
Yeah, I mean, the white maleness of my subjects did cause me anxiety. And, I think ultimately what I kept coming back to is that this was a story about configurations of US power, and that the key people who seem to have the greatest persuasive power on this issue with decision makers in Washington were, elite white guys. And so to a certain extent, that sort of meant that it would have felt a little disingenuous to suggest otherwise. Because while it's true that, somebody like Harrington is deeply connected to the American left and is perhaps more enmeshed than some of these other figures in what we might call kind of dissident, communities that are not necessarily right there at the heart of sort of American liberalism, the extent to which he doesn't really, in the documentary record, carry those perspectives to the people he's talking to in the White House shocked me a little bit. I mean, he advocates for a vision, but it's sort of his vision. And, I think that I did want to focus on the people who had power and who were trying to use power. And I think one of the things I try to, lest I, suggest that they were heroic figures by any stretch, one of the things I tried to do by framing the book with a critique that W.E.B. Du Bois makes starting in the 1940s and continuing into the 1960s is, they were also full of hubris, like lots of architects of empire are, and full of confidence that now, as I say, as somebody who grew up in the 1980s, that confidence looks sort of inspiring, but also, like all, senses that what the world should look like, also foreclosed other voices from the conversation, and or excluded other voices. And so I think that was something that I hope comes through in the book, is that they failed partly because they didn't really take seriously the demands that people around the world, mostly non-white people, were making for true equality and justice. And I think one of the things that I, as somebody who studies the Cold War, certainly want to make sure is clear in the book, and I hope it is that these were all Cold Warriors. They all believed that the United States had to win this thing called the Cold War. And they understood, they thought, the role that decolonization played in this sort of larger global game. And I don't entirely question their motives. I don't think they were just cynical in terms of promoting an idea of poverty fighting as a strategic tool, in a sense, in fighting that war. But the extent to which they took poor people seriously as agents in their own lives is, limited. And I think you see this from somebody like Oscar Lewis, who can be criticized on so many fronts, but the extent to which he is literally listening to poor people. He's taking ethnographic recordings of, his poor subjects, and even he is kind of concocting his own vision of what he thinks they're saying to him. So, John Kenneth Galbraith wasn't hanging out in Bed-Stuy talking to local residents. To a certain extent, I think somebody like Sergeant Shriver, towards the end of the story I'm telling, probably is exposed more to what people in those community action programs and VISTA and Peace Corps volunteers who are criticizing the work that the agencies are doing than maybe anybody else in the story. But they were not particularly open to seeing the perspective that those communities brought to them as valid. And I think they had a sense of what poverty was, why it was so important for the United States government to be involved in fighting it, and they pursued that plan. One of the things that struck me as so interesting is the degree to which all of them are kind of struggling with the political viability of this thing. Like, they know that the world making that they're doing is somewhat ambitious, and they're all proud of that, but they're also all contesting with how the sort of white power structure that they're in is going to respond to it. And the extent to which the political maneuvering is so clear in their work, seemed to me another indication that they weren't really worried about what, the director of a community action program who was actually on the ground in Oakland thought. Instead, they were worried about what, a congressman from Georgia thought. So I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it underscores the degree to which calling this an imperial project, makes sense on a number of fronts, including the front of imposing this vision that relentlessly keeps defaulting to culture and personality as the basis of the problem. It underscores that. But I know we want to leave plenty of time for Q&A, so I'll end on one last suggestion or request for some clarification. This is really underscored for me in your opening remarks about, basically, you said, this is a failed experiment, essentially. And I guess there's part of me that wants to push back on that a little bit, not necessarily this imperial project. I completely get that. But if we embed this as part of like the much broader struggle that was the struggle against poverty, whether on a global scale or in the US during this period, I'm a little troubled by the notion that we would leave this by saying that those struggles were an entirely failed experiment. Whether you want to point to the expansion of social democracy, whether you want to point to the important links between struggles against poverty and the Black freedom struggle, whether you want to point to as well, though, some of the lasting things that happened as a result of community action programs that have recently been recognized in the literature. I'm always a little concerned about calling the entire thing a failed experiment, because that has become so much a part of the prevailing political narrative of the war on poverty, as well as the historical narrative. So I wonder what thoughts you have about.
Yeah, I do want to clarify that. I don't think the war on poverty at home or abroad was a failure. What I think was a failure is the vision that these figures pursued to frame US foreign relations around poverty fighting.
Mhm.
So I think it's there, and I think the Vietnam War and the US's deepening commitment, throughout the story, I'm trying to show that there's this contest between visions of power, of visions of US power in the world, right? And so instead of kind of taking what now has become, I think, a little bit of a hackneyed notion of Cold War liberalism, that yes, they supported civil rights, and yes, they supported anti-poverty programs, but really they were hawks who also believed deeply in this militarist project and militarist containment. I'm actually trying to disaggregate that a little bit and say, no, there were many different kinds of Cold War liberalism that were in contest with one another and conflict. And so, no, I think the failed experiment part is, yeah, I want to be very clear, is the effort of the characters in this story to really center US foreign policy in the world around poverty fighting. And in fact, by the 1970s, having given up on this as the primary thing that the United States will be known for in the world in favor of strategic war in Southeast Asia, a lot of the men and women who actually populated the global war on poverty's programs, I'm thinking here very specifically of Peace Corps volunteers and VISTA volunteers, they go on to carry on the struggle against poverty through NGOs, through IGOs. I mean, so many of the sort. When I've done some interviews with people who have worked in anti-poverty, policy making and actually executing anti-poverty programs on the ground in the late 70s. And invariably, I find out when I'm having these conversations that these were ex-Peace Corps volunteers or people who worked in the war on poverty, in Head Start or in VISTA. So I think that, yes, I'm trying to be clever and say that this vision of a new kind of liberal citizen is perhaps the longest lasting legacy of the war on poverty. But also, I also believe that, the work of figuring out how to address poverty in all of its many, and to be more sophisticated, frankly, about how to solve that problem, is done on the ground in large part in the 70s by people who were part of this undertaking in the 60s. So no, it is. I don't think the actual war on poverty is a failed experiment. I think the United States building a foreign policy, as it had an opportunity to do after 1945, that was based on a more democratic vision of, sharing its prosperity with all, that is the failed experiment.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thanks.
Thank you. We're going to open this up in 1 second, but I have questions of my own, and I can't resist jumping the queue and getting my chair's prerogative in here, if I may. So I want to pick up on what Alice was just saying, and go to the conclusion of your book. And so the failure question. So let's think about the international side of things. And so you're talking about liberal reformers who thought in terms of poverty and affluence rather than justice and injustice. And that is at least partly why the enterprise failed. A global war on poverty was incompatible fundamentally with military action. And then you say, the failure had everything to do with a failure of will, courage, and empathy among those in charge of society. Guns, not so much butter. Where does political economy fit into this? And so if one is to fight a war on poverty globally, presumably one has a strategy. You have strategy, you have tacticians, you know where you're going. And simply, building dams or sending Peace Corps volunteers, few in number, under-resourced. No one's arguing that these people are flush with money. What King once said of the war on poverty, it's not even a battle, it's hardly even a skirmish. One could say the same thing here about the war on global poverty. And so political economy. So you're not talking about redistribution. you're talking about helping people do stuff in various places to perhaps modernize. But this is, looking back, not a strategy for success, is it? So what about the actual political economy and the political vision of the reformers that you're writing about? Could that be at fault here in helping us to account for why this doesn't transform the world the way they envision?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the emphasis that I place in the book on the concept of underdevelopment and the sort of incredible explanatory power that it has for all of these figures helps us understand this a little bit. You know, underdevelopment was the perfect problem to solve. You know, John Kenneth Galbraith wrote, having found the vaccine, we invented smallpox. It was a solution that, frankly, they thought would be effective and cheap. And, you know, of course, there were big infrastructure projects that people like historians like David Ekblad have written extensively about the way that those figure into the imagination of liberals in the post-war period. But the folks that I'm really interested in, I don't think they fully appreciated the complexities of the problems they were trying to solve, even when they were thinking, as Galbraith was, about political economy, because I think they were sort of, I mean, I hesitate to use the word kind of drunk on American affluence, but I think that they believed, again, they were very confident in the notion that they had solved the scarcity problem. And thus, if you could just figure out how to replicate what worked in the United States in other places, and, you know, create these sort of targeted programs that could help inject kind of the characteristics that had made American economic growth possible, that you could solve this problem, or at least go a long way towards solving it. And I think that they thought that the global economy itself would continue to grow. One of the things I ultimately had to cut out of the book, but which I think I still talk about, hopefully, is, you know, the power of economic growth as an idea. And that is certainly a subtext of the economic thinking of the people I'm talking about, is, you know, the extent to which they believe that that there was no ceiling on growth. So I think that's sort of how I would engage with their sense of political economy. You know, and actually Galbraith is particularly useful because towards the end of his career, he talks extensively about the failures of really understanding the scope of the problem, that, you know, emphasizing this kind of cultural or, you know, social aspects of underdevelopment obscured some of the ways in which these power dynamics, especially of colonialism, you know, fundamentally impoverished these countries. And so I think, you know, him acknowledging that seemed to me a good bit of evidence that that was something they didn't fully comprehend.
Thank you. Leon Fink, you've been waiting patiently. Your hand is up. Please unmute, join the conversation.
Thank you, Sheyda, for your important book, which I'm in the middle of and quite enjoying. I think that you've zeroed in somewhat in the comments and the questions already raised with you about the central dilemma of, as you call them, poverty-fighting liberals who are themselves caught in the between American power and American foreign policy, other American foreign policy objectives, and they're all, as well as their own humanistic values, how to balance them. And I'm intrigued by your treatment of one figure in particular who might be, I'm going to ask you what you think of him, what's your judgment of him? Because I guess my overall question is, whether do you think there was a poverty-fighting liberalism that might have worked out better than these people's struggles worked out in practice? Was there an alternative out there, a policy alternative and a political alternative? And let me zero in on one figure who I'm intrigued by your treatment, was very colorful treatment, it's very textured treatment of Sergeant Shriver, who crosses the international domestic spheres in his idealism and in his position as a policymaker. And I'm wondering, what do you think of Shriver's attempt to wriggle out of the dilemma of poverty fighting versus the guns and butter limitations of American foreign policy, and the move towards a war-making foreign policy as opposed to a poverty-fighting foreign policy? What did someone like Shriver represent, in your view, an opposition figure, or was he in the end, did he succumb in his connection to this empire of affluence? Was he really just another wing of servants of power and an apologist? What do you think?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you. Also, thank you for your work, which I relied upon heavily. I think Shriver was an especially frustrating figure for me because, not many historians of the war on poverty take him, or the Peace Corps for that matter, take him seriously. Actually, he's the number of times I've seen the phrase, the Boy Scout of the new frontier, redeployed in the scholarly literature, I think kind of gives us a sense of how he's been depicted. As a Nepo baby, I guess we would call it now, but also as somebody who was really good at PR, which he was. He was dashing, he was, articulate, he had a kind of energy and a capacity to sell people on things. So I see why that depiction has been so enduring. But what I was really shocked by, as I tried to really take him seriously and delve into his papers, for instance, was the extent to which he was talking about sending volunteers to fight poverty way back in the early 1950s, before he'd become a Kennedy, and the extent to which his work with Eunice Shriver, which turned into a marriage, actually started as a partnership addressing, the need for what he liked to call social innovation. So I, through those kinds of discoveries, really tried to take him seriously, much more explicitly than I had seen done in previous scholarship. And I was kind of rooting for him as I was working through the archives to begin to distance himself from the Kennedy administration's, strategic operations in the global South. And I struggled to find those places where I could see him being willing to challenge the powerful people that he relied upon to make arguments for poverty fighting. He does this with the Peace Corps. Every example I found of it is in the book. He certainly, it seems that protecting the Peace Corps from the US military and the CIA, for instance, were primary strategies of his. And the rare occasions upon which he called on Kennedy personally and made personal demands on the president all had to do with making sure that the military and the CIA kept their mitts off the Peace Corps. So I took that as a sign that there's a place where he's trying to use what power he has to protect this zone. But, he doesn't come out against Vietnam until very late in the game. And I think he, in a way, is sort of the most tragic figure in that he tried to maintain the kind of political influence that he had worked so hard to build up. He was, I think, a compelling and effective advocate for poverty fighting as an activity of the US government and for this imperial formation. I think he truly believed in it. But, when it came time to really challenging either a president that he served, or he also served Nixon, on the question of where they were going to put their dollars, he struggled to make arguments against Vietnam. And I think it is so deeply sad that, he acknowledges in what had been for a very long time an unpublished memoir, that, Lyndon Johnson signs the reappropriation of the war on poverty in 1966. He signs it on his way to Vietnam. And so this sense that I think he perceived that he had failed, but also I think he also, knew that he hadn't ultimately tried very hard. So he's a difficult character on this front, but one who I do think was advancing the empire of affluence as his primary objective. Does that help?
Thank you. Lewis Cooper, you've been waiting patiently. If you would unmute, pose your question.
Yeah, just a very quick comment about Michael Harrington. First, he wrote, of course, a lot of books other than Beside the Other America. Second, as you noted, he comes out of the left, out of the socialist tradition, well to the left of someone like Schlesinger. And his decision not to, I think he probably was acting pragmatically in the ways that you suggested. And the final thing is that his 1977 book, The Vast Majority, is about global poverty and inequality. And of course, it's well outside the period of your book, but I would just mention it for people who are interested in what Harrington thought about those issues, at least in the late 70s. That's it.
Yeah, absolutely. If I can just quickly respond to that. I do actually talk about that book in the conclusion of the book, precisely because of the extent to which I think in the writing, Harrington is he calls himself a tourist to the world's poor. And he's clearly very reflective in that book about what his contribution to thinking about poverty has been. But as I try to draw out in my own treatment of it, he's also reflecting some of the things that I argue, he was seeing in terms of poverty and underdevelopment in the early 60s. Just a small note, Harrington, becomes a professor of political science, and John Kenneth Galbraith winds up writing one of his tenure letters. So I think the extent to which we see Harrington as an outsider is notable. And of course, in this cast of characters, he is ideologically, but he also was an insider. And so we need to, I think, keep both things in mind.
Thank you. We have a question from William Cumbier, and this will be, I think, our last question. And he asks you to talk a bit about the United Nations and the prominence and the ideals of the UN that have filtered down. We are informed that the UN is engaged in fighting world poverty along with the affluent US over the years. Now, however, prominent UN agencies seem to have become the key ones on the front line of responding to poverty. We hear much more about UN agencies than about specific US aid. What's your perspective on the role of the UN, how it's changed over the period you focus on and in the years since?
Yeah, a great question. So I think this, again, speaks to what I'm arguing about the effort to make poverty fighting an American responsibility and its failure, that the UN does become the primary institutional vehicle through which the United States tries to engage in poverty alleviation around the world after the period I write about. And again, as I said in my remarks in response to Alice's comment, a lot of the men and women who run NGOs and IGOs, but especially NGOs that support the UN's work on the ground, do have Peace Corps and VISTA roots. And I think that, that speaks to the interconnectedness of this world and the different shape it takes after the war in Vietnam, I think sort of eclipses the global war against poverty. I think, yeah, I'm mindful of time. Should I go on or?
Well, we're at 5:29, so I probably should draw this to a close, even though we have numerous questions in the Q&A and one hand up. So my apologies for not being able to get those questions out there, but time is up. So I want to thank Sheyda, Nick, and Alice for this conversation, and those of you who have posed questions or wanted to. And I want to remind you that you can join us in just 3 days when we reconvene on Thursday, September 26th, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, to discuss Kidada Williams' I Saw Death Coming, A History of Terror and Survival in the War Against Reconstruction, with the author and discussant Alex Lichtenstein in an AHA-sponsored session. And then we're back on Monday, 1 week from today, September 30th, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, with Aaron Bateman's Weapons in Space, Technology, Politics, and the Rise and Fall of the Strategic Defense Initiative. Thanks, everyone. Hope you can join us next week. Good night and take care.